Dear friends, now, however, it is time to talk to you about a very important topic. Food prevention. As you all know, food prevention, nutrition is essential for our health and especially also for staying healthy and well. But before that, in our opinion, is very important information, so education on proper eating behavior. Poor nutrition causes more and more diseases such as diabetes, cardiovascular disease, obesity and cancer every year. Today I have here with me a chance to talk about all this thanks to some really very interesting guests. Let's start right away. On my right we have Dr. Gloria Mosconi, pharmacist, nutrition biologist with specialization in nutrition and supplementation for the diabetic and specialization in nutrition for the cancer patient. Welcome and thank you for accepting our invitation, Dr. Mosconi. On my left instead, we have Dr. Christian Orlando, molecular biologist. Good morning, and of course, welcome to our Dr. Orlando. And then next to me here on my right, we have Adriano Panzironi, writer and of course, popularizer, scientific. Welcome back. So this block, we titled it, Let Food Be Your Medicine. This is a famous phrase from Hippocrates. So I ask my guests if, first of all, they would like to comment on this very important phrase that was said practically 2,000 years ago. I mean, even more.
I think it is the basis of the concept of prevention, which has to start from the table, but especially starts from the supermarket. That is what we decide to put in our shopping cart. One thing that seems almost obvious, almost self-evident in reality, is the greatest mystification of dogmatic medicine. Because unfortunately, today's medicine does not understand, even does not train doctors for this, how important it is to have a correct lifestyle and then to introduce the right foods for our metabolism in order to prevent pathologies that are devastating for human beings when they decide to go down a wrong dietary philosophy, and above all, a prevention that can cure pathologies right at the moment they are appearing. So it is important that undoubtedly nutrition is chosen consciously, which is the reason for this day that we dedicate entirely to food prevention done at the table, precisely because people need to understand that there is nothing more effective than pure prevention, than correct nutrition.
Thank you, Mr. Panzironi. I obviously wanted to ask the same question to our doctors here, but a little bit more specific question I want to ask Dr. Mosconi, because today in this broadcast we are talking about food prevention. So first of all, is enough being done for food prevention? Much more could be done, I would say, latching on to what Mr. Panzironi was saying precisely. The thing that is important today is to get this information conveyed not only through general practitioners, family physicians, but also through institutions such as it can be precisely the school, because it is important to sensitize kids to proper nutrition. I believe that the primary aspect is the relationship between mother and child, because it is the mother who prepares and it is the mother who puts on the table. And so already from there, it is important to put foods that the child, when he is small, grasps, and that are precisely healthy foods, because then eventually it becomes a habit in the selection of foods to select those that are obviously healthy. And it is important that this message starts right from the mother and then continues to be carried on through even institutions such as school, etc. etc. And so educating from an early age is important precisely to also curb a situation that is occurring in Italy, and which we will probably talk about, which is precisely the issue of childhood overweight and obesity. So I start right from the origin of the Dr. Mosconi. Also here we go back to the core, what should be of our life, that is family. Family is a fundamental thing. I want to turn to Dr. Orlando, who I have here next to me, because as Dr. Mosconi was saying, enough is done as far as food prevention, education. I want to use this word also because in my opinion, there is never enough education. What do you think?
That's right. Yes, I also absolutely agree, and as Adriano also said, let's say it starts from the shopping cart, from what we put in there, because often what I do is just observe. I really like to observe the man, the human being, how he acts in front of the supermarket, so at the entrance of the supermarket to what is displayed in front of us. As the first thing, which are mainly confectionery products, cream, in short, pasta. So in short also, from the point of view of discounts, discounting is there that is put in front as soon as we come in. And I see in short, I observe in short, people put and fill this cart with these inflammatory foods, as we all know. And then another very important thing precisely is the fact of starting with children. I see it in my children. I have 2 children, a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old, and they observe what we eat and ask to eat what we eat because they imitate us. So it's nice to see my son asking me for the egg in the morning because he sees it from me. It's nice to hear me say, "Daddy, not this one because it contains too much sugar." We are talking about a 7-year-old because he was raised and educated in this way. And when he also comes from school and says, "But the teacher told me that fruit is good for you, you have to eat a lot of it," I laugh and I explain to him in short so many things in a very simple way, with a 7-year-old saying, "Teacher, be a teacher, so teach Italian, history, and what you have to teach for nutrition." Now I tell you, but because I have more titles in short than, because unfortunately society has always led address towards a certain type of nutrition, precisely made of carbohydrates and whatnot.
Then, of course, there would be so much to say regarding this topic. This is a brief introduction, but I then want to go to the specifics of some pathologies that unfortunately are the most striking when we talk about a diet, let's say, so incorrect. And for this very reason, I want to immediately open a new topic, practically diabetes, and for this we see the video.
Diabetes represents the disease that more than others reflects the opulence of modern civilization, virtually unknown until the early 19th century. Today it represents a real epidemic, which is increasing exponentially, especially in populations with Western lifestyles. In 1980, about 100 million people were diabetic. In 1995, we went to 135 million. In 2005 to 217 million, in 2010 to 285 million, and as of today there are 422 million sufferers. With this trend in 2030, there will be about 800 million diabetics in the world. To these completely out of control numbers, we must also add as many people who are instead living with hyperglycemia, thus an undiagnosed pre-diabetic phase that is still capable of damaging our bodies, exposing them to diseases such as cardiovascular disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, and capable of reducing life expectancy by more than 10 years.
The video we have just seen really incites some terror because the numbers are really impressive. Before we go on and then develop the discussion of diabetes, I want to ask our Dr. Orlando if he can quickly explain to us what this disease is.
Of course, then diabetes is quite a disabling disease that brings with it then in a chain other types of pathologies at the level of both the kidney, at the level also of the eye, and also at the level of the cardiovascular system. There are various types of diabetes. We have the type 1, precisely autoimmune, in which our immune system goes to attack the cells of the pancreas. Then we have type 2 diabetes, which is the predominant one, if we can say so, that is a diabetes, precisely in which it is dietary type, in which either you don't have enough production of insulin or you have the so-called insulin resistance. And then also at the cellular level, in short, you don't have sufficient response to it. Then we have gestational diabetes, that one. So during pregnancy, another type of diabetes is the monogenic one, so at the genetic level, then at the level of transmission precisely autosomal dominant, and then the last type of diabetes, which is that one, a diabetes induced, let's say, by other diseases or by drugs, in which you have precisely there also a decreased response to insulin, a decreased production of insulin due, again, to pre-existing conditions or medications that you come to take.
Then, in order to draft this broadcast, we went to look for data. So, in addition to what you saw in the video, we found some impressive data. So in the video, it said that the increase is exponential. Mr. Panzironi, we go from 100,000 diabetic people in 1980 to a projection of 800,000 diabetic people in 2030. And I tell you that we had these numbers downward in the sense that the projections are even worse than what we put in the video. Another thing that struck us is that in 2001, diabetes caused 7 million deaths, so 1 every 5 seconds. These are official figures from the International Diabetes Federation. And so, in short, these are disturbing figures, not alarming, but terrifying.
I think it's the normal consequence of a wrong diet. When our body is not able to produce such a high amount of insulin, given also the small size of the beta cells of the pancreatic islet, because this should already let us know at the biological level that we don't need, that is, our body was never predisposed to produce such high amounts of insulin. For example, I want to mention that one of the tests that doctors don't do, which is basal insulin, which is considered by dogmatic medicine to be in the range of 16 to 24 mg per deciliter. Actually, those who decide to follow a correct lifestyle, that is a low-carb diet, such as Life 120, have a basal insulin that ranges from 4 to 6. So we are talking about 4 times less than the insulin that is produced at basal level, if we then don't count the one that is needed in the glycemic peak instead. So it is clear that when we subject our body to such a high stress, such an excessive production of insulin, inevitably this turns into an inefficiency of the cells that have to read this hormone, into an inflammation of the pancreatic islets, thus the death of these cells, then the onset of dietary diabetes, which then very often can go as far as the overall destruction of the beta cells. It becomes a kind of type 1 diabetes. And all this is the normal consequence of poor nutrition. But even in 2050, it is estimated that there will be 600 million diabetics in the world. In Italy alone today, we have 2.5 million diabetics, and another 2.5 million have an impaired blood sugar problem, which will be in the next diabetics and in the next 5-10 years. I mean, really, the real pandemic is not what we have seen with COVID. It is very little compared to the pandemic of diabetes, which makes many more deaths and will make even more deaths. Because then, by the way, most of the diseases of the deaths in Italy are related to the triggers of diabetes. If we think about cancer, if we think about cardiovascular diseases, if we think about autoimmune diseases, they are all induced by an excess of carbohydrates, and especially in diabetic people. We see an acceleration of the occurrence of these related diseases.
Dr. Mosconi, based on your professional experience, of course, what kind of advice are you most often asked for, but more importantly, what kind of situations are you faced with? The situation is shocking, no half measures, and the diet rich in sugars and carbohydrates that stimulate, obviously, insulin. So insulin foods, anabolic foods, okay, are the evil of this century and are the cause of this big pandemic. Because the real pandemic, as Adriano said, and I absolutely agree, is just this. By the way, recent studies have just shown, going back to a speech that Adriano was just making, that the greatest level of survival, or at least longevity, is really given by a basal insulin that is from 5 and down. This is really a fairly recent study that has been conducted, and when we see that now consistently, the basal insulin that goes from 14 and up, this of course is predictive of a risk of developing diseases. And the thing that worries me is just that, based on my experience, they are starting to come into the study. The teens, the adolescents, the children. So you still see children as early as 10 years old who have this problem, 14 years old who have this problem, not with overt diabetes, but in a condition of preinsulinemia. The problem with pre-insulinemia, which is basically the antechamber of diabetes, is that unfortunately it is not diagnosed. So not diagnosing it is also difficult, and at an early stage to treat, and then to obviously then avoid the realization of diabetes. That's the big problem. So since in the introduction our Dr. Orlando had talked that diabetes is a precursor to so many then diseases, I want to show you this video on the harms of diabetes. Let's watch it together. Thank you, Director.
Every year, 27,000 Italian citizens die of diabetes, but even more serious is the increased risk of certain diseases in people with diabetes. In fact, 80% of diabetics die from cardiovascular diseases. In addition, 10% of people with diabetes suffer from ischemic heart disease, 32% from neuropathy, 34% from retinopathy that induces blindness, and 40% develop kidney failure that can lead to dialysis. In fact, excess sugar induces damage to the arteries and can cause conditions such as diabetic foot and poor repairability of skin lesions. In addition, many scientific studies have found an increased risk of getting cancer of up to 300% more than a person with normal blood sugar. On the other hand, for those who have already been diagnosed with cancer, the increased risk of metastasis is 400% in the first year and an increased mortality of 500% in the first 5 years.
In order to accomplish this segment, together with the editorial staff, we did this research. I have 2 pages of numbers that could put any epidemic to shame, as our experts have said here. So I turn to Dr. Orlando. Is there any way we can prevent or maybe even solve diabetes?
Certainly a proper diet helps us precisely to prevent, certainly to improve the conditions of life, and especially talking about type 2 diabetes. The dietary type diabetes is the one I repeat most common. It goes without saying that the moment we radically decrease the amount of carbohydrates and sugars that we go to take daily, our pancreas is not stimulated, therefore, to the production of insulin, or stimulated in any case in a very marginal way. And therefore, all these chain reactions are not triggered, so that precisely later on from the production then of insulin, of cortisol, to balance, in short, the insulin itself, we go through a whole series of precisely inflammatory pathologies that we saw in the video, and which then make our lives much more problematic, much more complicated. The problem, I always say, comes from the head, is the one that commands our brain, and unfortunately we are subjected to stimuli, in short, both on television and advertising of continuous sweet products. I repeat, sugars, carbohydrates, and that is where unfortunately we pay.
It all starts. What starts everything? We will elaborate on that later, because on this topic I also want to elaborate on the more adolescent, more childish part. But I want to go to Mr. Panzironi because I saw him armed in quotes with one of his books. He came here, and in fact I am afraid to ask you questions perhaps that you dislike. You have done this book. Can I take it so that we can show it to our director as well? The book is titled Living to 120, The Healings, which is basically a real observational study of the effectiveness of the Life 120 lifestyle. Here were 1,000 people who said what happened by following the Life 120 lifestyle. It's 1,000 people, all traceable, so it's a full-blown observational study. What kind of results did you get by then making this book, or what kind of results do you get by following the Life 120 lifestyle anyway?
Let us first start with the concept, what dogmatic medicine says and what we say, in the sense that diabetes is considered as an untreatable disease. And if you want to treat it, you have to use drugs, whether it is insulin in the most severe cases of type 1 diabetes, or with drugs that lower blood sugar to allow you, as they say, to continue a normal lifestyle, which is the Mediterranean diet. An absolutely absurd concept, because I imagine that any person who perhaps has not even studied medicine would easily understand that a carbohydrate diet in a person who has difficulty managing sugars is the worst diet you can recommend. In fact, diabetologists, who are those medical classes that are authorized to do diets for their patients, continue to administer the carbohydrate diet with up to 50% carbohydrates. So you start in the morning with rusks, however, with a veil of jam. At lunchtime, the 80 grams of pasta. In the evening, maybe some rice with a main course. In the end, the diabetic person has a recommended diet that is not totally different from what is recommended by a normal person. We go down from 60% carbohydrates to 50%, which means introducing during the day 400 or 500 grams of sugars, where there is a person who cannot even manage the few that should be needed for metabolism. So what have we done? What have I done in my book? Remember that the book Living to 120 is coming up on 10 years. It will be 10 years old in March. Simply, I said maybe an obvious thing, sorry, but the diet for the human being, but especially for a diabetic, is the low-carb diet, what is then called low-carb in America, with the maximum amount of carbohydrates that should go around 100 grams per day. This spread over the 3 meals and mixed with a protein-based and especially fat-rich diet greatly lowers the glycemic index of the meal, and at the same time you have a meal with a very low glycemic load. This is what does this bring? It brings actual healing results.
It seems simple even for someone who has not studied. Then specifically, as also the doctors here, a person like me who has not studied specifically diabetes. So this kind of disease, if sugar is bad for you, don't eat sugar. And of course, then there are, as Dr. Orlando always said, various types of diabetes. So you have to go to the specific. But if dietary, we go to control it.
But with the worst, the autoimmune one, I mean, even more so. Those who have type 1 diabetes have to eat less sugar than those who have dietary diabetes. We have had several cases, and we'll still have one today, of guys who have been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, have taken off all carbohydrates and managed to stay healthy without the use of the insulin drug, which is considered a lifesaver. In contrast, dogmatic medicine, what does it do to you? It prescribes you a diet high in carbohydrates and then tells you to give yourself an insulin injection to lower that blood sugar. That's the concept.
Let's see what results you got next in the Life 120 lifestyle.
In this observational study, we have 113 people who declared, because this is obviously an observational study out of 1,000. And so we followed them by phone, and there are people who started the lifestyle 6 months, but also 3 years. So let's say there is a mix of a fairly heterogeneous population, and 113 of these declared that they had diabetes, means obviously with a blood sugar above 120 mmol per deciliter. So we are talking about a real onset of diabetes anyway. The results are extraordinary, and we are obviously talking about people who were not 100% followed. So they followed the Life 120 pathway in a precise way, and maybe without making any snacks. So there will be those who made some snacks, there will be those who made it in a precise way, and so on. The results are that of this sample, 66% declared a recovery healing, means that by redoing them, the glycated and fasting blood glucose tests, basically he was no longer in those ranges that defined him as a diabetic. Resolved in part 32%. So 32% had a reduction of this percentage of impaired blood glucose, and therefore in any case already got a great improvement from the point of view of medication. This is also an important thing because medication makes sense where diet fails to solve the problem. 72% of the sample no longer use medication, and partly only 18% continue to use it. So results that if they were applied to an Italian population of 2.5 million diabetics in 3 months, you would have the disappearance of 1,600,000 diabetics in Italy.
Sure. So anyway, it's very important data that I think from this book can trigger not only reflections, but maybe even actions by our Ministry of Health.
If they were interested in this, maybe they would have noticed already a few years ago. It's been 10 years that we've been telling these things. There's never been anybody who has made a phone call to me to try to understand this huge Life 120 project and how hundreds of thousands of people have come back to health. So I want to say, let's be hopeful, because hope is always the last to die. I'm not talking,
before I close this topic, there would really be so many to say. I could also see Dr. Mosconi nodding while our Adriano Panzironi was speaking. I would ask you, Doctor, for a closure, maybe in 10-15 seconds, just to understand it well. the topic we are dealing with, which is diabetes, how it is possible to solve it and deal with it especially. I am going to be very direct and very frank. From type 2 diabetes, especially from type 2 diabetes, I refer to that you can heal, whoever wants to can heal from type 2 diabetes. Heal, I put it in quotes, because it is clear that a person, if he then starts eating again before starting a pathway, which obviously involves improving the glycemic index in order to make a diagnosis of non-diabetes, clearly goes back in the situation before, which is why I put it in quotes, but absolutely in dietary diabetes, as the word itself says, because it is dietary. If you correct the diet from type 2 diabetes, you can heal. So for those who want to, can heal. And it seems to me a resounding statement what Dr. Mosconi is saying, even at 10-15 seconds before obviously moving on to the new topic to Dr. Orlando.
I agree, from type 2 diabetes, the dietary one can be cured. It starts from the table. It starts from the brain. I insist on this because our will to improve the quality of life that is determinant than the gluttony. Also, because the brain that chases a series of cascades at the level of synaptic transmissions, anyway, of hormonal cascades that determines, in short, what we want and what we have to eat.
So it's time to thank my guests. So I thank Dr. Gloria Mosconi for being here and accepting our invitation. I thank Dr. Christian Orlando, here he is, for being with us today. And of course, I thank our own Adriano Panzironi for being precise and timely in his answers.